Okay. Hey, good day, everyone. It's Alan Shimel, DevOps.com, and we're here for a special session of a DevOps video chat. And I'm joined by my friend here. If we could pull the slide up, I don't know if everyone is able to see the slides of our handsome faces. There they are. Pete Waterhouse of CA Technologies, who we've roused out of bed in the middle of the night. Peter, thanks for joining us today on DevOps.com.
Hey, great to be here, Alan.
Thank you. And thanks for everyone who's registered and attending today. We've got a really great topic that we're going to talk about. Now, these are a little different than our usual webinars in that there's not a slideshow. It's not a that kind of presentation. It's more of a chat, and we will be able to take questions though from the audience. So if you do have a question, please use the question section of our GoToWebinar control panel. And I'm just hoping our audio is coming out okay.
I can't hear anything, so.
Yes, I'm not sure what happened here. But Peter, can you hear me?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes. Okay. I thought our audio went bad because I was seeing red in our thing. Oh, we seem maybe to have lost Peter. Peter, you there?
I'm here. Can you hear me?
Okay. I hear you fine. I just don't see the video, but it's okay. Anyway, what we're going to be talking about today is a subject that's near and dear to us, and that is okay. We're all okay now. Whew, that was close. Deb, if we can go back to our title slide, and what we're going to be talking about today is modern application monitoring. And, as Peter calls it, the DevOps XFactor. I have a different take on it, Peter, as you and I have spoken about. And that is really, for whatever reason, application monitoring has become sort of the forgotten child of the DevOps stack, if you will. We spend so much time talking about configuration management, CI, CD, ARA, pipelines, testing, DevSecOps, name it. And it's almost like at the point of delivery, once an application's deployed, we're busy on the next application or we're busy on the next project, and we don't give enough attention to how is that application performing. Are we, when we monitor the performance of this application, is it performing adequately? Not only that, we don't expect it to perform, 100% off the bat, but are we, it's so at the heart of DevOps, creating those feedback loops, right? Continuous improvement. Iterate, reiterate, iterate again and iterate again, continuously improving. How could you continuously improve your applications, your deployments, if you're not monitoring how they behave and how they perform after deployment? So why there's not a bigger emphasis, and it is the X factor, you're right. Why is this not being, why is it not getting the full attention it deserves? Peter, you've written books, you talk all the time on this. What's your take?
Yeah, look, I completely agree with you, Alan. I think monitoring doesn't get enough attention. And I think it's sort of funny. I was thinking about this the other day. I think part of it is it's the sort of historically where we've come from. Let me think back. I've been in IT. Gosh, I'm in the decades now, and quite a few decades.
You and me both.
So I don't really want to go there too much, right?
Longer than we care to admit, Peter.
But I remember, my first day at CA Technologies was, gosh, it was 30 years ago. It's probably 30 years this year. And the first job I was given a magnetic tape. And I don't know if any of the audience remembers what magnetic tapes look like, right?
Mhm.
I was given a magnetic tape and I was told to go and install some software. It was actually some financial management software, would you believe, for a customer. It was a CICS COBOL system, right? So you remember those sorts of beasts, right? So, I walked into the customer, all sort of bright-eyed and bushy-tailed and worked with a systems programmer to install this beast. And there was absolutely no consideration at all for monitoring. There was none. And why should there be? Because really, it was so back office that nobody really cared. If the system went down, it was back to the abacus or the handheld calculator, right, to do the transactions. You sort of fast forward that, and sort of in the client server sort of era, it sort of got more complicated. We started to get three-tier architectures. That was the sort of age of the sysadmin, if you like. It was, keep calm and call the sysadmin if something goes wrong. But sort of still monitoring was this sort of back office type discipline, measuring uptime, availability. And I think that's where it sort of came from. And then if you sort of move forward, now, of course, things are radically different. We've got these much more customer-facing applications. It's really much more now about the customer experience and the interactions you have with customer experience. So monitoring has really been thrust, if you like, from this back office type function. And culturally, I think that's where it's come from, to this thing where we said, well, wow, we've really got to do something about this. It's much more important than this sort of back office way that we've been managing and monitoring our systems. And I think that's something to think about, because I think that's typically where monitoring has come from.
Yeah, absolutely, and there is, you mentioned COBOL. It's funny, we had just last week on the site, someone wrote an article about COBOL, and
Right.
it went viral. There are a lot of old COBOL programmers out there in the world, Peter. But that being said, I wonder how much of the lack of emphasis or attention being paid to the monitoring is the fact that monitoring is truly an ops function, if you will, or traditionally been that's the heart of ops, right? And so when we see the rise of like the SRE, the site reliability engineer, and stuff like that, they're looking at monitoring a lot. But in our dev-centric DevOps world, right? They haven't quite figured out that that's part of that. It's part of DevOps. It goes to the heart of DevOps itself.
Yeah,
Think about that.
I think you're absolutely right. And you mentioned before feedback loops. Well, what better feedback loop than the performance of an application? I think that's very true. And I think I think this is the traditional problem, isn't it? That, applications have been developed, they've come over the wall, it's the classic DevOps. And then we sort of, wait for operations to wrangle them, get their heads around them and start monitoring them. And I think that's really changing. And I think what's interesting now is that, developers, site reliability engineers earlier in that life cycle have to take much more responsibility as well for the monitoring function. Because not only, are we looking for speed of delivery, but as we deliver those applications, we have to ensure a lot of things now, and we have to do it very fast. That's to bake in availability, performance, reliability, security, resilience, all those ET words, right? They all have to be baked into the application much earlier. And I think most development people realize that, and most operations people realize that, but it's this coming together, if you like, I think that's proving challenging for a lot of organizations.
So let me put forth a thought, and you can agree, disagree, comment. What you're talking about with a lot of the CYs, the resiliency, all of the CYs, let's call them, a lot of those refer to shifting this stuff left, getting it earlier into the development life cycle. software development lifecycle. So we're shifting left, we're shifting left, we're shifting left. By shifting so much left, application monitoring after deployment is something we can't shift too far left, right? Because it just can't happen until after the, it's physics. So by putting in, the emphasis on shifting left, are we at the same time, therefore, kind of taking the emphasis off of what remains on the right? You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I hear what you're saying. I actually think there's two important things. I think shift left's important. I also think shift right's important.
Perfect. Yep.
Here's my take on that. What we're saying with shift left is, let's take all this operational goodness that we know about, all these learnings that we've taken about systems, about monitoring, and let's move that earlier into the sort of development function, even the design function, as far left as we can go. But at the same time, what we need to be taking is the development smarts and moving those into operations too, right? And I think this is the shift right. And I think this is causing some consternation too, because a lot of organizations now should be actually starting to put developers on call. Now, that's a very controversial sort of play. And a lot of developers out there will go, hey, not me. But when you think about it, why shouldn't you do that? You've written the code. You understand the idiosyncrasies of that code. It's your baby. You should really be monitoring that in a production context. So I think, yes, shift right, but also shift left, but also shift right.
Shift right. You're right. And I, you know what, Peter, I think that is another development that's come out of the DevOps kind of mantra or framework of doing things. And that is the sort of the not just the monitoring, but the alerting and the idea of, more rapid escalation of issues, right? I don't have to give the developer the beeper anymore, the dreaded beeper, right? But with things like chat ops, right? And some of the modern alerting and, tools that integrate so tightly with our monitoring tools, we can get, even in large organizations, you're seeing developers as part of the level 2, level 3 type of troubleshooting here. I mean, not necessarily a war room, but, involved.
And I think that's important. And I think what's important as we, and I think it's easy to say, shift left, shift right, they're sort of easy things to say, but they're difficult to do. Because let's face it, if you're a developer on call, you want to make sure you've got the right tools delivering the right information in your world, right? You don't want to be going to multiple consoles, multiple monitoring solutions that perhaps you're not familiar with. Perhaps you're a Node.js developer or a Python developer. You really need monitoring information that's really presented in context of what you actually do and what your job is. And I think that's the struggle people have is bringing this information and presenting it in that way.
Understood. Peter, we've prepared a couple of questions we want to dive into, because I think we've really framed it well, though. I hope the questions don't come across as redundant. But, as we've spoken about, I do think it's changing, that monitoring is not, well, hopefully will not be thought of sort of as an afterthought within the DevOps stack, right? I think monitoring has to be one of the stars of the software development, lifecycle management. So I'm not sure there's not much discussion there. I assume you're agreeing.
Oh, right? Absolutely.
Yep. Let's get to this next one, though, that we've had here. And that is, what's the single biggest numero uno, right? The top monitoring challenge facing IT teams today?
Wow, there's so many. But, if I was to sort of choose one, I'd say that, I think the biggest challenge isn't just monitoring all the additional technology piece parts, right? I think it's always going to be complex, and it's getting far more complex, and there are always going to be tools to do that. There are great monitoring tools, if you look at the sort of monitoring landscape in terms of tools. There's probably 50, 60, 70 different tools, you know, in log management, time series analysis, graphing. There's a sort of smorgasbord of availabilities. But I think, you know, what's the problem is all those tools, if you like, they don't put themselves in the shoes of the customer. You don't get that sort of full sort of end-to-end view of the customer experience, you know. And if you think about business now, and this I think is where we've got some sort of misalignment with sort of monitoring, and this is why I think it's a challenge. You know, really, if you think of a customer now, he looks at your business in terms of his customer journey. Let me give you an example of that. You know, the other day I lost my ATM card, right? It was a big deal. I couldn't go and get any cash, right?
Yeah.
So and for me, that's a customer journey. That's a point in time where I have to interact with my bank. So to do that, you know, I actually, the first thing I did was actually log on to the web and reported my card as lost, right? The second thing I did was I used a mobile application, a cardless cash application, where I could actually go down to the ATM with a PIN number and actually get cash out. Fantastic. But at the same time, I was also calling the call center, you know, the helpline, to say, hey, where's my new card? So there were three sorts of interactions there, right? So that was, if you like, but when you think about operations and monitoring, what we tend to do is we align everything in silos, right? And the monitoring information is in silos. There'll be web data, there'll be infrastructure data, there'll be network data. So there's no sort of overall picture of that customer experience. And I think that's challenging because we've got those narrow centric views, if you like, and it leads to a sort of misalignment. You know, let's take, for example, a classic sort of monitoring problem. Let's say an infrastructure team detects there's a fault, right? Maybe it's a server fault. It doesn't really matter. They have the tools to fix that. They can find the problem. They can initiate root cause analysis. They can do so on. But what they don't have is insight into its effect on customer experience. That information might be held by the web team with their own set of data, with their own set of tools. So there's no sort of correlation of that information. And that can only happen when folks get together and start correlate and start analyzing that information. And there's a couple of situations that could happen. You know, that fault and alarm could lead to masses of war rooms, you know, people getting together, faults on consoles, all that sort of thing. Or, you know, people could miss the fact that there's a problem altogether. And I think the problem is that then you sort of get people sort of getting burnt out trying to deal with problems. They could be low priority problems or miss those really critical impacting business problems because they don't have that sort of end-to-end view of performance. And I think that's one of the biggest challenges that, you know, facing IT today and operations, right? It's this misalignment, because that's a problem, because you're sort of misaligned, you're aligned to sort of technology functions, and you don't see the picture from in the eyes of the customer, if you like.
Fair enough.
Makes sense?
It absolutely makes sense to me. So let's get all DevOps on you and talk culture a little bit if we can, Peter. With respect to IT ops today, how do you see the current sort of monitoring landscape as an issue of culture, right? In other words, as you said, there are 60, 70 tools out there, and you want to say one's better than the other one or whatever, that's fine. I mean, there's strata with the tools, some are better. But, you know, how do you get to the, you know, what role does the cultural element play here within the, you know, this whole bigger canvas of DevOps culture?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I think if you think of that, what I was saying earlier, you know, if you think about typically the way sort of IT operations is organized, and I was thinking about, you know, I was speaking to my son the other day, and, you know, he works in IT. And he said to me, I said, where have you been today? He said, oh, I've been to the network operations center. He said, those guys are really weird. They don't get out much. Right?
Yeah. But it's always been like that, right?
Yeah, it's always been like that. And I think that's sort of part of it, is sort of this sort of, we put our people in NOCs and war rooms. And I think the culture, and I think this is sad, right? And I think there's a DevOps play here, so bear with me. I think the traditional IT ops and monitoring culture, it's almost like warfare. You think about that for a moment. It's like, if an IT operations team isn't putting out a fire from the latest app release incendiary, right? Mm-hmm. From the bomb that's been thrown over the wall, they're triaging casualties, it's like, or, they're hunkering down in war rooms and command centers. And I'm with you, there's always going to be the need for crisis support. But if teams are sort of limping from one problem to the next in that sort of fashion, I think it's a personal and operational disaster. It's like, even with continuous delivery, apps can still be badly designed. It's like you've still got the operations people who have to sort of deal with the mess, if you like. And I think the sadness is if you've got this sort of culture, if you've got this sort of war room firefighting culture, right, how do people ever develop? How do they learn? How do they grow? And it's in these sorts of environments, it gets worse, when people are dealing with more alerts and alarms, and, they become almost desensitized to the problem. They start, putting the pager in snooze mode, right? Because
and that's exactly what happened. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, my background's security, infosec, cybersecurity, and that what you just talked about, the firefighting, going from one crisis to the next, desensitizes. And frankly, it's a huge problem in cybersecurity, but it's also a huge problem in IT op, and that is burnout. Right? You can only do that for so long, Peter, and then you're so burnt out, you get, I don't even want to bring it up, but you get like suicide rate spikes. You get, drug or substance abuse types of situations. You can't live crisis to crisis. You can't operate crisis to crisis without it taking its toll on people, right? Because it's a people problem.
I think you're absolutely right, and I think this is something that's so easily forgotten. As you say, if people are operating in this, I fear the phone ringing, right? Mm-hmm. It's be another 3 o'clock in the morning call. I'm going to have to be dragged away from my family at the weekend to deal with these releases that are just so poor that we have to try and roll back. I've got my manager on my back. No wonder people get burnt out. And I think that's why in monitoring, we have to move to, better methods to address that, right? Because it just sucks for everybody. It's interesting. I'm not sure if the hashtag is still out there, but I think 5 years ago, the one that was very prevalent was hashtag monitoring sucks. Right? I don't know if you remember it. And it was, I'm not sure if we've got to the stage where it's love monitoring, but, everybody sort of hated it. And it was almost like that. Almost like that sort of fear factor involved with it. So I think culturally it's a problem.
Yeah. So, but I also think that this is, again, I'm from DevOps.com, so I think there's always an answer in DevOps, Peter.
Sure.
So again, where can DevOps help here? And one of the principles that we talk about in DevOps is automation. And if we can get our monitoring to be more intelligent and then more automated, right? Because so many of the, separating signal from noise, right?
Yeah.
Automating, clearly remedial type of things that we used to have to rouse someone out of bed for, these kinds of things, so that if it gets to the point where we got to get someone at 3 a.m., it's not going to be damn well because it's the less, we have to get them up. It's not something that we could automate or, handle that way. So right. I think there's room for improvement there.
Absolutely, and I think automation is critical because if you asked maybe a lot of operations people, what's the bulk of your time spent doing? It might be, well, just looking at consoles, right? Just monitoring alerts, alarms, and this sort of thing. So I think we have to get to a state where, and I write a lot about alerting in particular. And I think we have to get to a state where automation makes it much more actionable, rather than, you being paged, all the time to sort of look at some sort of monitoring issue. We should have the systems that can, intelligently sort of, see the wood through the trees, if you like, so that, some of those issues, yes, they might be issues, but they can be sort of put on the sort of lower priority list, and you can deal with them tomorrow when you get in your normal sort of hours of work. And I think that's very critical.
Right. I mean, if you can contain the fire, right, and do it that way. So, we've spoken about a lot of potential ways this can go, Peter. What do you see, though, on sort of the immediate short-term horizon on what we can do to impact some monitoring strategies?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things. I think one of the things is sort of, maybe before we sort of get into that, I think if you are you see yourself as a DevOps sort of progressive organization, I think what we have to do, and I think this is tough, right? I think you have to start giving operational monitoring more management visibility, right? Mm-hmm. And, and you might think, well, no, we're just operations. But, you think about it, you can start to, talk to your management about, the sort of human costs, if they like, But if that doesn't work, what I think we should be doing with monitoring is actually bringing it to the forefront, if you like. So, if you do have, all those sorts of latency problems, mobile app crashes, start to present that in a business context. Start to look at sort of solutions and capabilities that say, we've got issues, and this is the actual impact on revenue, profitability, customer conversions, because that gets attention. One of the real smart DevOps examples I came across recently, and I thought this was fantastic. It wasn't something too technical. What an actual operations manager did was she actually started taking consoles and moving them into the lines of business, monitoring consoles. Right? Mm-hmm. She wasn't showing a lot of alerts. She was sort of aggregating this into sort of business-centric views. So these sort of monitoring consoles were physically placed in different areas of the business so that everybody had line of sight into what operations meant for the business, right? It was like, what's that up there? It's, well, that's your service. Oh, it's green. That's okay. Oh, it's orange today. Well, this is. And I thought that was a sort of very interesting cultural play, because that sort of really brings monitoring from the sort of back room into the business. And she even put one in the CIO office. I
was going to say, move it to the exec level. I wonder if that opens a can of worms, though, in some respects. Right? Oh, my goodness, it's orange today. Why? Well, let me tell you why. And wait a second, you're speaking, a foreign language to me.
I think you're right. It takes a lot of guts, and it takes a monitoring solution that can actually take operational bits and bytes, the guts, if you like, and present it in a common language that everybody can understand and see the ramifications of. It was a ballsy play, pardon the French there, but I think that's the sort of techniques and tactics that people can start to develop to bring it forward. Right? As I said, the other one I think is, yes, I'm passionate, put developers on call. I think this is important, because they know the code and they can start to sort of address it too.
Great. Let me move on to another topic, Peter. And this is something that, I used to say this promises to change the way we do things. But I think we're beyond the promise stage, and we're seeing it change the way we develop and deploy. And that's the infrastructure that we're on. And I'm talking about containers and then microservices, et cetera, that kind of go with this. What do you see as some of the gotchas or the idiot tax type of plays that people can avoid when setting up monitoring for these new style infrastructures?
Yeah, look, I think that's interesting. What are some of the gaps? I think personally, because I've been doing a fair bit of work around the sort of container and container orchestration space at the moment. I think the easiest trap people can fall into, when managing these systems, is that I like to think of it as it's like the old Spider-Man sort of quote, great power brings great responsibility. Because now you have these sorts of solutions, like Kubernetes, OpenShift, all this sort of wonderful stuff where you can say, okay, I declare to you my orchestration system, how I want my system to be deployed, how I want it to scale, and that's all sort of put into the application, and it goes off and does it for you, right? Now you have systems that they spin up containers, they can self-heal. And that can actually be a curse because you can take your eye off the ball, right? Because now that you've got those sorts of stuff, we can start to say as development teams, well, okay, we've got these wonderful self-healing systems. We don't have to test anymore. When you think about that for a moment, we don't have to do any load testing or we can neglect it because all of these systems are going to do that sort of work for us. But, that's not the case. Even though these systems are doing all this wonderful scaling, there's still that sort of responsibility to build in that, availability, performance, resilience into those applications. I almost liken sort of this trap as using a sort of example from real life. It's almost like managing a motor car, right? A modern sort of typical family car. And if you think about it, with modern cars, when was the last time you looked under the hood?
Yeah.
Ever? Right?
I will tell you, one of the fellows who work here in the office had called me about 2 weeks ago that his car wasn't starting, and if I could give him a jump, booster cables.
Right.
And no problem.
Did you have any jump?
I had booster cables in the garage. We haven't used them in 5 years, but they were there, wrapped up really nice. I put them away, and I ran over to his place to give him a boost so he can get to work. And we opened the trunk of the hood of his car. First of all, I couldn't find where the positive terminal was because it was like it went into a box, and you couldn't get to the battery. The battery was even closed. But, and I thought back to my high school years where I took auto shop, Peter, right? And we were capping spark plugs and changing distributor caps. And there's none of that in a car. It's a different technology altogether.
But in a way, you've hit the nail on the head. It's similar in IT today, right? Because we you and I probably tinkered around with cars because we had to, right? Because when we were students.
Because I want to. Yeah.
But now we've sort of become so complacent, with automation, with auto scaling, with self-healing that we think, oh, these things are going to look after themselves. But that's not true, right? And I think the danger is you lose sympathy. They call it mechanical sympathy. You still need to understand what's under the hood. Even in the world of containers, you might think you can cram more onto a server, but there is a server somewhere, and eventually. It's going to hit, you're going to get non-linear performance problems when you start to cram too much, into the tin, if you like. So you need to understand these things with monitoring. And it's difficult as well, if you think about it, neglecting something like load testing, just because you think your container management system is going to fix everything, right? That's a sort of horrendous position to be in, because load testing gives you that sort of customer's perspective of how real customers are going to be interacting with your application. And another issue, another gotcha is, if things are self-healing, right? If container management and container systems are self-healing, that's still an indication that there's a problem. And that might be a persistent problem, right?
Yeah.
The problem doesn't go away, it's just being hidden. So you still need essential monitoring to be able to say, yes, that was a problem. We need to fix it and make sure it's not repeated. It's really
agreed. And I think, Kubernetes has now graduated the Cloud Native Foundation. Not 100% sure what that means, but as we see this new infrastructure continue to roll out and replace or grow on top of traditional cloud even, I think we're going to learn more best practices for how to monitor them in the best way, and take that feedback and just do a better job with our applications in general. So
yeah,
that's my hope anyway, Peter.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think it's important to really get a handle on these new technologies from a monitoring perspective, because again, the danger is that monitoring could be avoided because you've become it's the curse of convenience, right? It's like these things are so convenient to use, we don't have to monitor them anymore, and that's just not true.
Yep. Okay. I've got one more question here I wanted to hit on, and that is, we've spent the last 40 minutes or so talking, and the title of our session is, monitoring becomes the DevOps X factor versus the forgotten child. Can you really believe it can be the X factor, Pete? And what's it going to take to get us over the hump?
Yeah, look, it's sort of provocative sort of title, the X factor, isn't it? It's like, and I was thinking, what exactly does that mean, right? Well, the X factor, it's that, I think if you look in the dictionary, it's that special quality something has that you actually can't put your finger on, right? You always got the X factor, right? Or, a solution, it's the X factor. And I think for monitoring to sort of gain that sort of level of, sort of X factor-ish, if you like, it's got to start, it's got to be able to support continuous delivery and testing, right? It has to be shifted left. It's got to be actually baked into the pipeline, right? And I think this is interesting. This is something I was considering the other day. If you asked an organization today, what's your most important application? There'll be, different sort of responses. Oh, it's our ERP system. It's our customer-facing web application. But to me, one of the most important applications is the pipeline. I always like to think of the pipeline as an application, right? Because that's serving other applications, that's building our future. And I think monitoring in that context needs to be part of the pipeline, almost to a point that it's sort of seamless, it just happens. As you maybe are doing a Jenkins build with Docker and Git, monitoring just happens. It's just there delivering critical information on performance. I'm not just talking about, checking functional testing or anything like that. I'm saying baking monitoring into that build process. During testing, being able to load test at scale. And there are fantastic solutions to do that, unashamed plug here for BlazeMeter. Being able to simulate, millions of customer synthetic transactions globally, right? But what if you had monitoring too that could seamlessly integrate with that client-side view of a transaction, but actually give you the back-end root cause analysis of any performance issues that are affecting those millions of users? That's an extremely valuable proposition. That's where monitoring, if you like, becomes, very special. I think monitoring, it's also, to have this X factor, I also think it has to take on this sort of analytical moniker too, not just detecting problems, but, and anomalies, but as we said earlier, giving people a life back, ending this sort of on-call war room dilemma. And I think, it's all about that as well. It's all about shift left. But if I was thinking about monitoring, and the best monitoring, and I might be slightly aspirational here, but, if you think of monitoring, instead of, sort of constantly fighting fire, what if we had predictive analytics baked into our monitoring that actually could tell our design teams that your designs suck, right?
Yeah. Better monitoring tool than us, but go ahead.
What if instead of chasing alerts at 3 o'clock in the morning and band-aid fixing, we could use analytics to identify in-stream coding practices that correlate to the best customer experience? That's pure DevOps, isn't it? And that's what monitoring should be. What if instead of the end of year budgeting squabbles where you don't know what we're going to invest in the future, what if you had real-time inputs into the correct placement of your workloads across multiple clouds so that you could make real-time investment decisions? That's the special X factor. And I think that's what monitoring has to elevate to.
Peter, what a great way to come to the end of this, and that is really it. We used to use a term at one of the companies I founded called actionable intelligence. Right? What we wanted to provide to our customers was actionable intelligence, and that at some level that should be the end game or the goal of a lot of this monitoring. Provide actionable intelligence.
Yeah.
It doesn't, because everything else is just not important, honestly, right? I mean, having the green, yellow, red light paradigm, we've been through that. It's great. But some of the stuff you're talking about here, trying to, it's not self-healing, but heading off the issues before they become issues.
Heading off the issues, but actually giving folks, within and across the pipeline, that actionable intelligence to make better decisions, to code better, to test better, right? I think that's
the key there, Peter. Monitoring has to be part of this pipeline, and you know what? I've seen other companies and I've seen other reports where they talk about the software development lifecycle management and pipelines and so forth. And they ended the deployment and they don't have the monitoring. And fundamentally, I think that's how we started and that's how we're going to end. We need to change that equation.
I think so. There's another sort of analogy or metaphor I always use, and that is you can be fit, right? And I think this is the emphasis within continuous delivery. It's all about speed, right? I'm the best athlete. I can pump my pipelines out. But just because you're fit, it doesn't mean you're healthy. Right?
Yeah, that's a great analogy too.
You can be the best. You can be the best athlete in the world, but you can still drop dead tomorrow, right? If raw.
I agree. And how apropos in a week where we saw Roger Bannister, the first 4-minute miler, right? He lived to 88, so he was fit and healthy. Anyway, Peter Waterhouse, CA, thanks for joining us today. This was a great discussion on the X factor of DevOps monitoring. Let's hope some people take this to heart and we check back in 6 months or a year and we actually see progress being made here as monitoring becomes more closely aligned with this whole DevOps stack that we see developing.
Right, absolutely.
Yep. Peter, thanks for being our guest today. Peter,
Great
no problem, Peter. We'll let you start your day very early. Peter Waterhouse of CA Technologies here today on DevOps.com. Thanks, everyone, for joining in, and we hope to see you soon on another DevOps.com event. Have a great day.